Thank you for the invitation to speak at this event today. I'm looking forward to what promises to be a fascinating session. I want to start by acknowledging that today I'm joining you from here. This is on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. As a white settler academic with an Australian father and a Scottish mother, it's important to acknowledge that I live and work on Aboriginal land, and I extend my respects to other First Nations elders and communities, including the many communities whose cultural heritage is held by museums and archives around the world. And I welcome any First Nations people joining this session with us today. So I want to talk to you about Australian First Nations collections material and about the relationships that we have with these artifacts, the stories about them, and the communities where they're collected, or in many cases stolen. In particular, I want to talk about this idea of critical connections and authentic relationships, and the small actions and connections that create the complex systems and patterns we see every day. So the actions and connections that create ecosystems and that create societies. The first record that we have of Europeans collecting Aboriginal artifacts is from 1770. In the words of contemporary Wiradjuri Kamilaroi artist Jonathan Jones, Australia's collections methodology started with Captain Cook stealing shields after shooting at someone. I've always used that as a bit of a benchmark for the acquisition process of this country. And we'll come to a shield shortly. So the British also took spears. As Darawal man Rod Mason points out, their connection to these spears is not just to the items themselves, it's a connection based on continuing practice. And as Rod says, no one can take that away from us because we've been doing it all our lives. So in an exhibition at the National Museum of Australia, spears from 1770 were almost swamped by an array of spears made more recently. So this sort of reduced the aura of the comparatively few spears stolen by the British and emphasizes this continuing practice. By contrast, here are some harpoons displayed at the iconic Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford in the late 19th century. Augustus Pitt Rivers talked about typology and trees of progress, about the idea that we should be trying to unravel the true thread of events to place objects in their proper sequence. In doing so, Pitt Rivers and many of the typologies and classifications that followed were in effect disconnecting artifacts from their communities. They were unraveling them from their context. And in doing so, these systems removed many more connections than they created. So it's interesting to see displays of Australian Indigenous material in contemporary museums that are visually similar to these earlier displays. Here's one at Melbourne Museum. But displays like this at Australian museums are often also quite different. So in front of each of the cases for these displays, digital tablets where visitors can look up items. So here they can find images and maps and rich descriptions. They can find photographs of items being made, stories about how items were made or their significance within communities. And the arrays of items include contemporary artifacts as well as ones collected by earlier ethnologists and anthropologists. These sorts of displays were developed with assistance from a ULENG group. So that's a Kulin word for knowledge and intelligence. As the chairperson of that group notes, there are cultural authorities, they are co-curators with the museum team. And part of their job is to stitch things back together. This is from one of the members of that ULENG group. This idea of stories and cultures join things together and to weave them back into their context. The term context itself has roots in the idea of weaving and fabric. So through collaborative processes of storytelling and knowledge exchange, we can stitch these things back together. It's a process many Indigenous people refer to as yarning. There are other examples from other museums around the world where we see similar metaphors. Here's a wampum belt used to help explain the curatorial approach at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. It shows two rivers or paths representing two knowledge systems that will never meet. But the fact that both are here stitched into the same piece of cloth means that these two paths are still brought into a relationship with each other. This idea of two-eyed seeing is also a key feature of the WA Museum Bullabardip. So this is in Western Australia. And this opened in 2020 after a 4-year, $400 million renovation. As noted here, the perspectives of more than 70 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander language groups are featured throughout the museum in an approach known as two-eyed seeing, where Western and Indigenous knowledge is placed on an equal footing. And it's not just in the Indigenous cultures galleries, it's also in the science galleries where First Nations creation stories are incorporated into presentations about how the universe was formed, for example. And the museum includes displays like this, where Noongar Youth Ambassador Brianne Yaron talks about holding a codge or an axe. She says, when I'm holding the codge, I'm connecting with my old people, my ancestors. We are looking and talking to each other. We're having a yarn. So these connections weave together different sorts of stories, different meanings, and different ideas. As this panel from the same museum notes, some of this is in the eye of the beholder. We view landscapes through our cultural lens, this panel says. Our worldview influences what we see. I want to hold on to these examples and ideas as we think more specifically about museum documentation and catalogues and online collections. And taking this idea of landscape, I've heard museum documentation described as like a kind of map. But we need to remember, as with all these previous examples, that maps encode particular worldviews. And that's why I started my talk with a map of Aboriginal Australia. It was a small action, but these sorts of actions add up. A map of Australia that shows the states and major cities, the roads and highways, many of them named after European explorers, would do something quite different. It would reveal some things, but in doing so, it would conceal others. Like in this passage from the wonderful Wiradjuri writer Tara June Winch about the idea of maps, which finishes with this line, "That's a little what a map does, takes the light out so you can't see." So if we think about museum documentation, what's revealed by documentation like this? Sir Joseph Banks, Captain James Cook, HMS Endeavour. These associations refer to men and the ship that landed in Australia in 1770. This is an item that may have been acquired from Sir Joseph Banks. The item being described is a shield, and here it is. It's in the British Museum, and though its identity is contested, some people believe it might be one of those shields Captain Cook stole. But it also says in the all it says in the catalogue is made by Aboriginal Australian. And this term in itself is problematic, bringing together two anachronistic terms that tell us nothing about the context of this shield and its creation. If it is one of the shields stolen by Cook, it was stolen from Gweagal people, a clan of the Darawal people who are the traditional custodians of the land in what's now southern New South Wales. That's why if you Google Gweagal shield, you get 4,770 results, including an article in Wikipedia. This notes that in the Gweagal tradition, it's most likely the bark shield dropped by the warrior Kuman when he was shot in the leg by Cook's landing party. So you'll also get a lot of images of this shield and the people connected to it. But if you type Gweagal into the British Museum collection search, you get nothing, 0 results. Some people might suggest that the shield's identity is contested, so perhaps it shouldn't be specified as a Gweagal shield. But if you enter Captain Cook shield, you'll find it. If you enter New South Wales shield or Botany Bay shield, you'll find it. The description even quotes Sir Joseph Banks describing the men they met and the shields they're carrying. So particular voices are being prioritized through the documentation used here. Think about the connections this creates and the connections that it breaks. The decision to use Aboriginal Australian and not Gweagal or Darawal. The decision to include a quote from Banks but no Indigenous voice. The decision to name a ship but not the warrior Kuman. When filling out fields in a collections management system, these might seem like small actions, but combined with many similar small actions, not just at the British Museum, but at institutions around the world, these combine to build and shape systems, collections, professions, and societies. These small actions shed light on some histories and knowledge systems, while leaving other ones off the map. So here's another example from the Wellcome collection by Europeana. It's an Australian Aboriginal, here with a lowercase a, which itself is problematic. An Aboriginal stone knife mounted in handle. And we get a similar story. Its type is listed as museum object. The classification terms include things like Indigenous non-European medicine. And the provenance only mentions the Wellcome collection here. The rights for this item also given as the Wellcome collection. And at the bottom of the page, we see similar items, which are clearly based on the source institution rather than the item itself. So they include an Inuit snow knife, an ancestral effigy from Middle Sepik River, and that's in New Guinea, and 5 African statues. Think about the relationships and associations this documentation and this presentation creates, the categories and classifications it reinforces, the rights it claims, and what's excluded, what's unraveled by these sorts of connections. Or to North America, where we have this. I've blacked out the photograph here and have assurances this is in the process of being removed, so I suggest you don't go looking for it. It's a chiringa that's only listed as from Australia and is donated by Spencer and Gillen. But as Spencer and Gillen, the white anthropologist, noted in 1899, chiringa is a name given by the Arunta natives to certain sacred objects which, on penalty of death or very severe punishment, such as blinding by means of a fire stick, are never allowed to be seen by women or uninitiated men. This is a secret sacred artifact presented as a donation from two white men, linked to their names, digitized and put online. There are hundreds of examples I could use for this. There are thousands. We could be here for days. As Wiradjuri man Nathan Sentence writes, these examples decenter First Nations people. They don't recognize First Nations people as creators of culture and history or as knowledge holders, and only gives them the role of subjects. Often even the role of subjects is only a generic one, assembled from colonial concepts, Aboriginal, Australian. There are examples of institutions doing more than this. Back to Museums Victoria, which includes Melbourne Museum, we find descriptions where First Nations people are named. We have details about clans, places, Indigenous regions. We have makers who are named. The institution here still retains control of the documentation, but the terms and classifications used reveal much more of the complex social and cultural context of these items. Something like Songlines went further. The exhibition itself was a massive success. It was first installed at the National Museum of Australia in 2017 and is now touring the world. As the curator Margot Neal noted, the paintings included in the show and the images in the show are beautiful in their own right. But they're also, as she says, receptacles of ancient knowledge and narratives, as well as being portals to real places. You can learn what happens there, where there is water, where there is danger, how to sustain life and how to sustain place. They've been made by people who own the knowledge. The exhibition emerged from a broader project, one designed to preserve stories and culture. And this wasn't a project initiated by the museum. It was initiated by elders. And these elders proactively wanted to record, film, paint, make, and dance 7,000 kilometers of songline across 3 deserts. That material was then deposited with an Indigenous managed archive, Ara Iritja, that runs on the Keeping Cultures collections management system, which you can see here. So this isn't institutional documentation, it's community documentation, and the communities decide what is captured, who gets access, what's shared. In other words, this approach to documentation prioritizes a very different set of relationships and creates very different systems. So I want to finish up by thinking about this idea of relationships. Sean Wilson describes how Indigenous worldviews can see reality not as something external, something we observe and document objectively, but as something constructed. An object, he writes, is not as important as one's relationship to it. When we think about relationships in museum documentation or in digital collections, we often end up talking about things like linked open data. But many of these models are relatively mechanistic and algorithmic. They often prioritize efficiency and scale and openness. What if we were to prioritize different sorts of relationships, like Natalie Harkin, who weaves items, including clothes, from copies of archival records related to her family history, prioritizing the personal, the emotional, and the aesthetic aspects of connection. Continuing the theme, what if we thought of context not as a set of fields in a database, but something we need to weave together from various strands carefully so that it can carry things like a basket, a way of sharing things, sharing knowledge, and building connections. And if our documentation weaves things together in this way, who do we need to collaborate with us on those processes? Or to move away from the idea of needs, which sounds like a box that needs to be ticked, what sort of relationships could we create if we invited people to weave these stories and contexts with us? Better yet, what if we develop the relationships of trust so that the people who hold the knowledge start to invite us to weave stories and contexts with them? What would our documentation systems look like? What would our work look like? And what sort of ecosystems would we start to create? So here's Sean Wilson again. I recommend his book on Indigenous research methods, Research is Ceremony, if you're interested in these ideas. Wilson says that we need to include the idea of relational accountability. So it's not about being right or wrong, it's about being accountable to your relationships or to your relations. The initial step here is to decide who we want to be accountable to. So some might say to their institutions. But as we're here talking about decolonization, many of our institutions sit on stolen land. Mine does. Many of our institutions hold material that's been stolen or taken in problematic ways from First Nations communities. If decolonization is to be more than a metaphor or a buzzword, we need to take practical and concrete steps that recognize and work with those facts. Working in Australia, for me, that means considering whether my work contributes to Indigenous sovereignty and the pursuit of voice, treaty, and truth that came through in things like the Uluru Statement from the Heart. When I work with First Nations communities and collections, I aim to be accountable within that framework, though I know I don't always succeed, and to the First Nations people and communities I'm working with. Sometimes that means my relationship with my institution, my profession, my discipline, or my career ambitions needs to drop down the list. So how do we approach this as people interested in museum documentation? In the words of Burma man Tyson Yunkaporta, not by simple categorization, that's for sure. He argues this oversimplifies things, creating fragments that are tagged and ready for display, but detached from their historical context and from Indigenous knowledge. And I'd argue that some of the examples I've shown today certainly fit that category. But to my mind, even an item like this at Museums Victoria again also still remains detached. There are a lot of categories here and a summary, but not a lot of stories, not much context. This item isn't woven into history and culture or part of a patchwork quilt of stories that adds up to something greater than the sum of its parts. It's just a fragment of something much bigger. This is the description for a rope with harpoons attached. It was sitting in the bottom left corner of that case at the Melbourne Museum I showed earlier in this presentation. And it's itself woven from many strands. I know a lot about this rope, and some of you have seen me present before, might have heard me speak about it. How it was used for hunting large sea mammals called dugong off the coast of Northern Australia. How it's made from hibiscus fiber. And the story is that a being called Katara came and told the men how to make the rope strong. A coil of the rope became a rock formation on the coastline, and Katara was transformed into a silver gull. He links community with plants and animals, landscape, geology, story, and much more. But if I'm truly accountable to my relations, these are not my stories to tell. Just because they're out there in exhibitions and open journal articles and out of copyright publications out there in the world, doesn't mean I can just take these stories and use them in any way I like. I have spoken briefly with community members on Cape York about this item and speaking with them about permissions to use this item in things like presentations, but I haven't spoken to them in detail about documenting this item and those stories that are attached. If I want to do that, I need to develop my relationship with those communities further. I need to go and work with that community just as I already work with other communities. So those are the critical relationships here. Those are the relationships to which we need to be accountable, not to institutional metrics or managers, not to meet digitization targets or contribute to a particular percentage of a collection that needs to be online. There are some collections where those sorts of metrics might work, but they don't work in these sort of spaces. And that means that documentation, even for a small item or a single item, can take a lot of time because it starts with building those relationships. That doesn't mean we don't do the work. It means we need to learn to slow down and give things the time and the space that they need. At first, the results will seem small actions, small connections, small fields in documentation systems. But those small actions and connections can change the systems we work in, and enough of those small actions over time can change societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Are you finishing? Totally. Can I pass to the press? Thank you very much. So it was gorgeous. It's always beautiful to think about the soundtrack and your image of the maps and the tracks are beautiful. Thank you very much for that, Mike.